in our communities and in our court. So I want to start by offering a special thank you to the Municipal Court of Stonecrest, and want to offer if Chief Judge Curtis Miller, Mallory Miner, or Victoria Harris Ferguson want to share any words before we get started here today.
Just a couple of words. Hi, everybody. I'm Judge Miller, Curtis Miller. And I'm very happy that on this law day that we can have a program that's informative for all of you all who are somewhat involved in the criminal justice system or some other court system, because we'll find that survivor victim impact has an impact on a lot of areas, and it's good that we have Kira here to get us thinking about how that may affect what we do in our jobs, and in my case and a judge's case, in our determination of how to fix a situation that's gone bad. So thanks everybody for coming, and we look forward to getting some information that we can take with us when we leave. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and happy Law Day. My name is Mallory Miner, and I am the court administrator here at the great city of Stonecrest. And I appreciate Kira and also our court staff for allowing us to host this outreach today. And I'm just really excited about the information that Kira is going to share with our court and with all of the class of courts and our citizens that are here, because it is important. It is an important topic. And as Judge Miller stated, we do interface with survivors each day. Oftentimes we see abuse in many forms. And one form that we recognize is the economic abuse that sometimes survivors have to overcome. And they may be faced with challenges and may be cited with citations such as theft by shoplifting. And so you all being here today is just another way that we can help to facilitate some resources to those individuals that come to our court. So again, we are super excited. Happy Law Day to everyone. And we are going to go ahead and get started. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Chief Judge Miller and Mallory, for those words. Mallory's already kind of giving some insight, right, into the scope of domestic violence. And so let's go over, a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. We're going to start by naming the connections between domestic violence and the court. I'm then going to share a little bit more about the organization that I work for, the Women's Resource Center to End Domestic Violence. We'll talk about what domestic violence is and is not, and combat some of the myths that exist about domestic violence. And finally, we'll talk about how we support survivors, what it means to be a quote unquote purple court. We wear purple because purple is the color of domestic violence, representing the color of a bruise, right, that many of us have to hide, but also recognizing that purple is that color of healing. And so we'll leave questions. Of course, I encourage you all to make use of the Q&A feature. I'm happy to answer questions as we go along today. And we'll make sure that we leave room at the end for questions as well. In terms of some additional expectation setting, this is a general content warning that we are going to be talking about domestic violence, sexual violence, physical violence today. I'm not going to be going into super detailed descriptions. I will play a short video with some survivors sharing their testimonies. And so I'll give you all a heads up when we reach that portion. And so please take care of yourselves, right? The purpose of this webinar is really to inform, and we're trusting everyone that if you need to take a step back, take a break, take a breather, grab a glass of water, do what you need to do to take care of yourself and your body as we talk about these hard and heavy topics. And finally, we want to acknowledge that none of us are going to become experts in domestic violence in our 1 hour together today, right? The goal of today is really to reframe the way that we think about domestic violence and to give us some tools, right, to begin connecting with resources and some tools to bring in to the court and to our lives about how we think about violence and power. Okay, so when we talk about domestic violence and the court system, right, the thing that most often comes to the forefront of people's minds might be filing a temporary protective order or a TPO. And these are issued by the court to protect against future violence. And because we are here today with the municipal court, and these TPO cases in DeKalb County are heard by Superior Court and magistrate court judges, we are not going to be discussing TPOs today. We are not going to be discussing how to file TPOs. So if you have any questions about what a temporary protective order is, how to file it against an abusive partner, whether that's related to family violence, dating violence, or stalking, I encourage you to call my office, the Women's Resource Center, at 404-370-7670. And you can connect with one of our legal advocates who can walk you through that process in greater depth. So if we're not going to be talking about TPOs today, right, what is the connection that we're seeing between domestic violence and the court? And first, we want to acknowledge that the court is a representation of our society, right? And the general statistic that's out there that is true for the state of Georgia, true for the United States, and true globally is that 1 in 3 women will experience domestic violence in her lifetime, right? And so that means that you may be a survivor, right? We may have survivors in our families, survivors who are our friends, survivors who are our coworkers, right? And so what would it look like to move through our day, recognizing that we are more likely than not interacting with survivors on a daily basis? Beyond the general representation of survivors in society, we actually see an overrepresentation of survivors in the criminal justice system and in the court system. And we sometimes call this the abuse to prison pipeline, right? Some statistics show that 60 to 94% of people in women's prisons have a history of physical or sexual abuse before incarceration. And there are many reasons for this that we'll get into, the most common of which is that survival strategies are routinely criminalized. And so we see that sometimes as part of economic abuse, right, as Mallory was sharing earlier, folks experiencing economic abuse may have to resort to survival strategies like shoplifting, right, in order to feed their family, and may end up in the court system as a result of that. We also know that as part of coercive control tactics, sometimes abusers will force their partners to participate in illegal activity. We know sometimes that folks turn to coping strategies like drug use in order to cope with the trauma of domestic violence, right? And that can sometimes lead folks into the court system. We know that being unhoused is a risk factor, right? And especially we see that, unfortunately, sometimes women, particularly women of color who are experiencing domestic violence, try to fight back or try to defend themselves. Sometimes they are criminalized for that behavior as well. And so there are a lot of reasons that we see these connections between domestic violence and the court system. And so as we move through the rest of today, I really encourage us to think about how we would move through our day-to-day, right? Sometimes it's easy to get caught up in the daily grind, but how would we move through our day-to-day if we thought at the start of every day, I'm going to be interacting with survivors of domestic violence. How do I want to be approaching folks, right, today? So that's a little bit of our framing for why we're having this conversation on Law Day today. Shifting gears to talk a little bit about the Women's Resource Center. So the Women's Resource Center to End Domestic Violence was founded in 1986. specifically to support survivors in DeKalb County. We were unfortunately founded in part as a response to the preventable death of Gwendolyn Ann Turnbull, who was murdered by her ex-husband. And so our mission is to create a society in which domestic violence no longer exists. That means doing the work today to provide direct support and services to survivors today, to keep survivors alive today, while also working for a tomorrow, right? Where we are violence-free, where domestic violence no longer exists. And so that includes, of course, education, advocacy, and prevention programming. So our WRC programs are geared towards three primary audiences. The first is to survivors. And so some of the services that we provide are legal advocacy. Like I mentioned earlier, if you have any questions about the legal process, about TPOs, or other legal questions related to domestic violence, please call our legal advocates. They are in the office Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. They are wonderful. We also have a safe house in DeKalb County, and this is a safe residence in an undisclosed location that provides safe shelter for folks who are fleeing domestic violence. We also offer a 24-hour crisis line support system, as well as peer support groups twice a week. And finally, we offer financial assistance. And we see most often that folks access this financial assistance for reasons related to housing, typically moving costs, relocation, or short-term stays at hotels. We also offer programming to children, in part because most of the women who are staying at our safe house have at least one child under the age of 12 years old. And so it's really important that we provide that two-generational model, again, to support children in coping with what they witnessed and experienced today, but also as a form of prevention programming, because we know that children who witness domestic violence are more likely to themselves experience domestic violence or to perpetrate domestic violence against a future partner. And so all of our programs are rooted in social, emotional, and ethical learning, encouraging children to learn how to self-regulate, how to build more peaceful and healthy relationships for themselves and for the future world that we're trying to build. And so we offer an after-school program throughout the year. During the summer, we offer an 8-week free camp called Camp Peace that is offered to any children who have gone through our safe house. And then we also offer supervised visitation and exchange. This is called Nia's Place. And the purpose of this is to prevent any future harm from occurring. These are sometimes court-mandated visits. And so we have monitors who are available to ensure that the parents do not ever have to interact, and also that no further harm occurs to the children during this visit. In terms of our community programming, this is one example of our education and prevention work today, trying to connect with as many folks as possible. And so while we're all here on this webinar today for Law Day, we'd love to stay connected. Please invite us to come speak at your church, at your community center, at your child's school. We are really, really passionate about this mission, and we want to hear your stories and your experiences and how you think we can be providing better services as well. So I'm going to play here a short video. It's about 4.5 minutes, where some folks who are previous guests at the Safe House and some former board members are going to share some of their own testimonies about experiencing domestic violence, as well as some of the support that they received from the Women's Resource Center. You'll get to see what the inside of our Safe House looks like. And so I'm going to play this, and please just let me know if for any reason you can't hear the video, and we'll make adjustments.
When I met Eddie, he was incredible, but I can look back now and see there were a lot of warning signs. We lived together. I got pregnant. He beat me up when I was 5 months pregnant, and I lost that child. a few months later, I got pregnant again, and I carried that baby to term. I knew after I had Jemiah that I had to get out of there. So I left Eddie and went to my mother's house, and he followed me there. He broke into the house and he kicked my mother hard. So I went home with him. You know, I had to listen to his tirade as he held a gun at my head about how this was all my mother's fault. I didn't go back because I wanted to be with him. I went back when he kicked my mother. I went back when he hurt my sister because I wanted to protect them. If there'd been a safe house, there would have been something else to do. And I could have figured out how to not live in fear of me and the people around me being hurt.
I will never forget the day that we dedicated the new safe house, the day it was completed. And it was like a dream come true. It was so beautiful and so much larger than what we had had. And it was a great feeling, a sense of peace that these women would have this place to go and to be with their children until they could get their feet back on the ground and find their way again.
Just put yourself in the place of the phone rings and you don't know if when you answer it, you're gonna get hit. Or if you don't answer it, are you gonna get hit because you're a lazy pig? Imagine living like that every day and the phone ringing, something so simple, is a traumatic experience. Nobody deserves to live like that. And too many women and children do live like that and need a safe place to go.
You can't realize your highest vision of yourself if you're always thinking about keeping 2 steps ahead of a fist. And you can't be your best and your highest self when you feel afraid all the time.
Miss Barbara wouldn't let me leave until she felt like I was healed. Not only like what I'm saying, but I could talk about it now and not feel like I want to hurt him. Every time that you want to hurt him or every time you curse him, he's winning. It took a lot for me to get to that point, and I don't think I would be able to do that on my own.
All people deserve to be happy and free from suffering. And I really think just the idea of that is one of the most important things we offer at the Women's Resource Center, because we offer an opportunity to be free from physical suffering, and we offer the opportunity to be free from emotional suffering, because we let people understand that feelings come and go. You can have an umbrella, even with the most difficult feelings raining down on you. You don't have to let them soak you or drown you.
So I always like to just take a deep breath in and a deep breath out after hearing some of these testimonies. So some of the folks in the video have shared some of their experiences, and so we want to provide a little bit more context and framing around what domestic violence is. At its core, the most basic definition of domestic violence is that it is a pattern of behaviors used to gain or maintain power and control over another person. So again, a pattern of behaviors used to gain or maintain power and control over another person. And so many times folks will frequently think about physical violence or sexual violence. We also recognize that there are many other forms of abuse under the umbrella of domestic violence. And this can include economic abuse, as Mallory spoke to earlier. It can include emotional abuse, psychological aggression, digital abuse, stalking, and we might also refer to domestic violence as dating violence, family violence, or intimate partner violence, depending on the relationship. And a domestic violence agency in Duluth back in the 80s and 90s created this power and control wheel to help us conceptualize a little bit more what these various forms of abuse and violence look like, right? What are some of the tactics that abusers might use, again, to kind of go beyond the scope of just physical and sexual violence? And so it can include things like using coercion and threats, right? So these threats might include threatening to leave or threatening to hurt yourself. Can also be coercion around making someone do illegal things, as we spoke to earlier. That is sometimes how folks will end up in the criminal justice system, is as a result of this. These threats can also be related to, for example, if someone is an immigrant who is undocumented, right? There might be threats related to calling ICE, right? So folks might have fear of deportation and might not report as a result. Other tactics include using intimidation, right? And we know with this example of displaying weapons that when there is the presence of a firearm in the home, the risk of homicide increases by 500%. We see emotional abuse here, right? And this can look like many different things. Using isolation, minimizing, denying, and blaming. Gaslighting has entered some of the mainstream discussion when we talk about different tactics that are abusive. Using children as a threat or as a tool. And again, this is why it's so important, the work that we have at Nia's Place to provide those supervised visits to ensure that children cannot be used as weapons against their parent. Using male privilege, right? Or using other forms of privilege. I mentioned migration status earlier. If a woman is not a citizen and is in relationship with a citizen, she is 3 times more likely to experience abuse in that relationship, right? So we would see in that case someone using their citizenship status or racial or ethnic status and privilege against that person as part of these power dynamics. And finally, using economic abuse, right? Which again, Mallory had spoken about earlier. Some of the other things that we know about domestic violence is that it frequently occurs in a cycle. So it starts with a period of tension building. It evolves into an explosive incident. There is a period of reconciliation and then a period of calm, or the honeymoon phase, before this cycle repeats again. And while it is a cycle, we actually might think of it as a spiral, because we know that these incidents tend to occur more frequently and to become more severe over time. And so the center of that spiral, unfortunately, is homicide. And so it's really important that when we see these cycles or spirals of abuse begin, when we begin to see this pattern of behavior, that we intervene as soon as possible and walk with folks on their journey to get to safety. We also know that domestic violence can happen to anyone, right? Domestic violence knows no race, class, age, gender, religion, right? 1 in 3 women will experience domestic violence in her lifetime, and the CDC reports that 1 in 4 men will experience intimate partner violence in his lifetime. While society is quick to practice what we call victim blaming, we also know that ultimately the only person who is responsible for domestic violence is the perpetrator themselves, right? So this idea that only the perpetrator can stop the violence. Y'all heard in the video earlier, Shelly was sharing some of her testimony, right? And the idea that the phone would ring And if she answered it, she might get hit. And if she didn't answer it, she might get hit. Right. And so in this situation, there are steps that survivors can try to take to keep themselves as safe as possible. But the only person who can truly stop the violence is the perpetrator. We also know that mental illness, substance abuse, and stress do not cause domestic violence, right? So if someone is both perpetrating domestic violence and they are experiencing these other things, they are responsible for managing both, right? So for example, if a perpetrator of domestic violence is also struggling with substance abuse, those are two distinct issues that that person needs to seek healing and support on. While anyone can experience domestic violence, the majority of the violence that is perpetrated by men, and specifically 90% of people who commit serious physical assaults are men. And we can look to, many different reasons for this, but especially our socialization around patriarchy, around masculinity, where some men are raised to believe that it is not only their right, but their responsibility to exercise power and control over the people in their lives, right? So again, as we are addressing domestic violence and trying to build a society without domestic violence, this means not only interrupting domestic violence when we see it in relationships close to us, it also means changing the ways that we think about masculinity, for example, right? And really building towards a more just society. And finally, it's not as simple as quote unquote just leaving, right? Leaving is an incredibly dangerous time. Leaving is when a survivor is most likely to be seriously injured or killed by an abusive partner. And we heard this a little bit from Shelly, right? Where she left and went to her mom's house. And that was when her ex, Eddie, came after her, right? And was threatening to hurt her mom and her sister. And so people stay for many smart and strategic reasons. And Shelly chose to go back to Eddie in that moment because she was trying to protect her family, right? So we know that there are many reasons why folks may choose to stay. That can be related to their finances, that can be related to their physical safety, that can be related to the safety of their children, right? And a person will leave an average of seven times before finally leaving an abusive relationship. And so it really is a process of walking with folks, supporting them on their journey, so that they're able to safely leave. And yes, leave with as little harm possible. I want to pause and welcome, if folks have any questions, feel free to put questions in the chat. And otherwise, I will go ahead and move on to our next section, which is around recognizing that it's a journey, recognizing that it's a process. How do we support survivors?
Hey, Kara. So we did receive a couple of questions. I'm going to take this time to ask those. Are services provided to survivors outside of DeKalb County?
Excellent question, Mallory. Yes, services are provided to survivors outside of DeKalb County. Anyone is welcome to call in. We just have a relationship with the DeKalb County courts.
Okay, and we have another question. I am a mother of teens that are starting to date. How do I start this conversation with my teens?
Such a good question. Yes. So we know that these conversations can be a little bit uncomfortable and difficult to have, right? And so we recommend starting by just creating a safe space to have the conversation with your teens, right? To sit down and say, okay, I want to learn a little bit more about your life and what you're looking for in a relationship. What do you think a healthy relationship looks like, right? And we found that starting by talking about healthy relationships, especially when children are young, well before their teenage years, is incredibly helpful in terms of prevention, right? So start by asking, what do you think a healthy relationship looks like? How do you want to be shown respect in a relationship? How do you want to be shown love? But then also, how do you want to give respect and love in a relationship, whether it's a friendship or a romantic relationship, right? Once you talk about some of those pieces of a healthy relationship, then you can talk about some of the red flags, right? Or unhealthy behaviors where we start to see maybe someone is being super possessive, right? Maybe they're showing extreme signs of jealousy. Maybe they're asking to check your phone, right? Or they're insinuating that you're cheating when you're not. Maybe they are coercing you into sexual acts that you're uncomfortable with, or maybe they're raising their hands against you, right? And those are all things that are not okay. And so listing out some of those behaviors of, hey, these are things that you never deserve in a relationship. And not only do you never deserve them, no one else ever deserves them either, right? So we're never going to do that to another person. And then the final step of that conversation is to create a plan of how you want to connect with your child if they have any questions about healthy relationships, or if they notice or have any questions about those red flags we just talked about, right? So maybe you have a code word with your child because it can be a hard thing to kind of bring up depending on your relationship. And so maybe it's having a code word. Maybe it's just coming and saying like, hey, we had that conversation a year ago and this question came up for me, right? It's about establishing that frequency of communication and continuous check-ins so that your child feels comfortable coming to you, disclosing that information, and you all are building that trust. You're showing that you're a trusted person in their life. And in that way, you're actually demonstrating what a healthy relationship looks like too, showing that they're deserving of love, trust, and respect. That was a longer one. I'm very, very passionate about that. All right. So with that, I think we'll transition into our next section, which is around supporting survivors, right? Recognizing what domestic violence is, how do we shift to supporting survivors on a daily basis? And so particularly in this context of municipal court, I was talking with Mallory and Victoria before this session around what would it mean to be a purple court, right? What would it mean to be a court that truly is a safer place for survivors? And so there are three things that might represent a purple court, right? That might represent and support survivors. The first is to understand the widespread impact of trauma and domestic violence, as well as healing. The second is to respect everyone, right? Treat everyone you meet with dignity and change some of those community norms around violence, around power, right? So that every conversation is rooted in that respect and dignity, reflecting a healthy relationship. And then finally, connect, right? Proactively share resources with everyone, because again, we never know what anyone is going through. So proactively sharing that information with everyone you meet, not just the folks who you think might be experiencing an abusive relationship. And so we're going to go into each of these a little bit deeper. So starting with the idea of understanding the widespread impact of trauma. Right? We know that domestic violence can be an incredibly traumatic experience, and that trauma can be a result of a one-time situation or experience, and it can be the result of an ongoing series of incidents, right? And ultimately, trauma is rooted in a person's perception of that experience. And so, especially as institutions, we have a responsibility to be trauma-informed. And the 4 R's of being trauma-informed are realizing the widespread impact of trauma. Again, we talked earlier about 1 and 3 and 1 and 4. Recognizing trauma symptoms, responding by integrating knowledge into policies, and doing the work to resist re-traumatization, which we'll talk more about in the next section. Some of the principles that guide a trauma-informed approach are establishing safety, right? So what do you think it would look like in the court to establish physical and emotional safety for everyone who comes through the doors, right? How do we build trustworthiness through transparency? Again, survivors have experienced betrayal in relationships that were meant to be close and loving, right? And so that trust and transparency is so important. Peer support is another example, which is why we offer those peer support groups. The concept of collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, and attention to systems of power and oppression as we move through the work, recognizing that marginalized communities are especially impacted by compounded trauma. So what are some of the impacts of trauma? Again, while someone may experience domestic violence for a period of time, the impacts of that trauma can be ongoing and sometimes lifelong, right? So we know that trauma can impact us physically, cognitively, emotionally, socially, and mentally. I've included a couple of examples here, right, where the research shows that survivors are 3 times more likely to have a major depressive disorder, 3 times more likely to participate in self-harming behaviors. They're 4 times more likely to attempt suicide, and 6 times more likely to have a substance use disorder. So these are heavy, right? These are heavy, and recognizing that while we see many of these, right, also thinking about just the physical impacts that survivors may experience, right? For folks who are familiar with the ACEs study, Adverse Childhood Experiences, we know that trauma and toxic stress can result in heart disease, can result in diabetes, can result in early death and other forms of disease, right? We think about survivors who have experienced physical abuse, and many, I think it's 40% of survivors who have experienced strangulation or who have been hit in the head have lost consciousness, right? So then we think about the impacts of traumatic brain injury and how that shows up over time in the body and impacts decision-making, right? Again, all of these things that may unfortunately lead to that abuse to prison pipeline. And again, recognizing that we work not only with adult survivors, but also with children, many of whom have an ACE score of 6 or more. Folks with an ACE score of 6 or more are 46 times more likely to become IV drug users. And so it's really recognizing that trauma is not a one-time thing. Trauma is a lifelong journey, and it can look like many different things, right? It can look like some of these diseases or self-harming behaviors. It can also look like irritability, mood swings, difficulty concentrating, right? Confusion on the stand. And it can look like many, many different things. And so holding space for all of that, and also holding space for the fact that healing is possible, right? We believe that a person is never defined by their trauma or by their experience. And so as we work to support survivors, right, to understand the trauma-informed perspective, that also means believing wholeheartedly that people are capable of healing. And so that means being fully present, not making assumptions about folks, actively listening, right? Being an active listener, whether it's at the courthouse, whether it's, in the break room at work, whether it's at home, whether it's at a barbecue with family and friends, being an active listener shows the person that you care and that they matter, right? And the more grounded you are as a listener, the more regulated that your nervous system is, the better you are able to support that person, right? Especially when we're in physical space together, our nervous systems can co-regulate, right? So you can help support that person on their journey. The next piece is normalizing behaviors, right? So we talked about some of these behaviors that might be identified as problematic, right? So behaviors like shoplifting, behaviors like drug abuse, right? Behaviors like unhealthy coping mechanism. But reframing those, right, as not that person did bad things or that they are a bad person, right? But that person was trying to cope as best that they can with incredible trauma. And so there doesn't have to be shame in that, right? normalizing behaviors as best attempts to cope. And then finally, supporting self-regulation, right? Through choice, self-soothing, and building that safety wherever possible. So those are some of the ways that we can approach understanding the impacts of trauma and understanding the potential for healing as we move forward. The second piece is to show respect, right? Ultimately, supporting survivors is about rooting every action in human dignity. And as we talked about with the trauma-informed perspective, resisting re-traumatization. So I want to talk for a minute about power, right? When we think about power, right, just if you feel comfortable, feel free to close your eyes for a second. When you think about power, what are some of the images that come to mind for you? And are you experiencing a positive feeling or a negative feeling, right? What direction do you think power moves in? We are socialized in our society to understand power as a form of power over, right? As a form of force, coercion, domination, and control. And we can even recognize that sometimes in the court system, right, we even have this sort of power over dynamic, right, where someone is responsible for making a decision that has power over another person's life. That being said, when we go back to that basic definition of domestic violence, right, that domestic violence is a pattern of behaviors used to gain or maintain power and control over another person. This negative form of power, right, this negative form of power can be incredibly re-traumatizing for survivors. And so rather than reinforcing power over, we want to think about how power can shift to be building power with another person, right? Again, we talked about that trauma-informed perspective of being in cooperation, collaboration, solidarity, right? In addition to building power with, building power to, right? So supporting someone's agency to make different choices, right? To make a difference in their lives, to participate in healing. And that's that empowerment, voice, and choice within the trauma-informed framework. And then building power within oneself, right? So supporting folks in developing that own self-confidence, self-awareness, and understanding of their own dignity. And so again, this basic showing of respect is one really important way that we can support survivors in reframing how we think about power. And that makes the difference in the courtroom. And that makes the difference in just how we show up on a daily basis, right? Checking out of the grocery store, right? Just because I'm the person checking out or paying for my groceries doesn't mean that I'm any better than the person who is checking me out, right? We need to get rid of this power over mentality and shift to building power with, power to, power within, recognizing each other's dignity on a daily basis. In addition to reframing power, we also want to reframe violence, right? Violence is almost assumed in our society. And we think about the ways that our society, through various forms of socialization, actually supports violence, right? But everyone deserves to feel safe and seen. No one deserves violence. And violence is actually a choice, right? Particularly on the individual interpersonal level, right? And then folks who uphold systemic forms of violence, right? These are choices that we're making that actually violate each other's dignity. And so thinking to ourselves every morning, what is one action that I can take to disrupt that violence, or to show that violence is a choice, or to show that violence is not okay, right? These are some of the ways that we reframe and that we live out our value of respect. And finally, increasing our own capacity to do this work, right? Because this work is hard, it's heavy, it is ongoing, it's lifelong. And so it can start by giving ourselves permission to bring a beginner's mindset, right? To practice a lot of humility and to say, I know a lot of things, but what if I were to pretend like I was brand new, like I know nothing, right? Acknowledging that it's okay to not know, it's okay to be curious, it's encouraged to be curious. And then we might actually be able to see things more clearly when we bring that beginner's mindset. We also want to show a lot of self-compassion for ourselves and practice wellness for ourselves, right? We've all heard that phrase, we can't pour from an empty cup. And when we care for ourselves, we're able to be more grounded, right? So that if someone is showing some of those trauma responses that we talked about earlier, if someone is super irritable, right? If they're really confused, if they're taking a lot longer, if they're experiencing mood swings, we're able to be grounded in ourselves and not react to that trauma response, right? And again, that leads to this last point, right, of showing that the impacts of trauma can be really hard to navigate. They can be really overwhelming, right, because they show up in so many small and large ways. And so holding grace, holding compassion for ourselves and others, and not judging ourselves or others as we notice the impacts of trauma as we move through. And finally, we want to connect, right? The third part of being a Purple Court, the third part of supporting survivors that we're talking about today is proactively sharing resources. Again, we never know what folks are experiencing, what folks have been through. So many of the survivors who are at our safe house have shared, or who participate in our support groups have shared with us that sometimes their kids' teachers don't know what's happening. Sometimes their family members don't know what's happening, right? And when they're showing up to court, they might not be announcing right away, I'm here because of, right? Or I'm here in relation to the abuse that I just experienced, right? Or I'm here for this reason, but 2 years ago, I'm still healing from this really painful, traumatic thing that happened. And so we want to, again, approach the world, imagining how would we connect as many people as possible to these resources, knowing that we may never know who needs them, but almost everyone knows someone who will need them, right? So proactively sharing resources, and the municipal court has been absolutely incredible. We've been dropping off a bunch of pamphlets, flyers, other resources. And so we invite you to do the same and to connect with us in a couple of different ways. So the first is that you are always welcome to call our crisis line, 404-688-9436. That crisis line operates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, right? We are here for you. We want to answer your calls. And you are welcome to call the crisis line for anything related. If you are a survivor, you are, of course, welcome to call the crisis line. But if you're a concerned family member or a concerned friend and you just have questions, you're also welcome to call the crisis line. We encourage you to do that. We're happy to walk through the ins and outs of safety planning with you. Again, the purpose of today is not for you to become an expert, right? But to really be someone who can be a resource for other people, connecting folks with the resources that already exist. And so if you have questions, please give us a call. We're happy to support your ongoing education, as well as connect directly with folks that you are concerned about. We also welcome calls about legal matters. So you're welcome to call our main office at 404-370-7670 for any questions related to legal matters. Our legal advocates are absolutely fantastic. And finally, if you want to volunteer or if you want to have any other community education events or advocacy events, please send me an email. Again, the phone number is the same. You can email volunteer@wrcdv.org, or you're welcome to email me. So again, a Purple Court is one that understands the widespread impact of trauma, respects everyone, and is proactively going to connect and share those resources. So I'm going to pause there and see what questions are coming up for folks.
Okay, Kira, I'm checking the Q&A. I don't see any additional questions in our Q&A, but if you all have questions, please go ahead and add them to our Q&A chat now. If you have questions later on, feel free to reach out to Kira directly, or you can forward those questions to our court at courtinfo@stonecrestga.gov. This has been such an informative discussion today, Kira, and we appreciate you celebrating Law Day with us. I see that we do have a question inside of the chat here from Nuseba Smith. What kind of time commitments are involved with volunteering? I'm interested. And I want to give a shout out to Nuseba. She's one of our students at a local college. So thank you for being here, Nuseba. And such a great question. We'll go ahead and get Kira to answer that.
Thank you so much for this question. I love it. So what kind of time commitments are involved with volunteering? We welcome you to participate in whatever kind of time commitment is most sustainable for you. So our request is that if you are going to be a regular volunteer, whatever you commit to, it is something that you're going to continuously show up for. So typically, we try to get folks on a weekly schedule or at least a monthly schedule. And if you are, only able to do 2 hours a week or 2 hours a month, that's okay. We welcome your support. There are lots of different opportunities to get involved at our main office with legal support, with admin, working directly at our safe house, working in our children's programs, lots of ways to get involved. And so again, the reason that we request that folks make a consistent commitment is especially because so many folks are working directly with folks who have experienced trauma, especially for children. It can really increase the trauma of the experience if someone isn't able to follow through on a commitment. So that's why we really request that consistency. So thank you so much for that question. And please do email me. And apologies, folks, because I believe my last slide got cut off here. So I'm going to be sure that in the slide deck that Mallory uploads, my email is included on there, all my contact information. Happy to share that. It's Kira, and let me see if I can put it in the chat here as well. My email is kira@wrcdv.org. I welcome any emails, questions, comments y'all have.
Okay, Kieran, I see that Adrian inside of the chat says thank you. And we thank you to Adrian for being here with us. We appreciate all of the support from our Georgia Municipal Court Council. I see that we have a lot of municipal court clerks representing, and I encourage you all to become a Purple Court. We have partnered with Women's Resource Center, and we are now in possession of a number of handouts. And so these handouts are not only available to our court users, but also to our citizens here in Stonecrest. And we would like to make those resources available to you. So you all have taken the first step. You all are now informed, and we invite you all to become a Purple Court with us. And you will be provided with some safety tips, a guide to their services, and also a teen handout for you all that may have teens or know some teens that need to be informed and encourage those healthy relationships. So again, we appreciate you all, and that concludes our celebration of Law Day with the Women Resource Center. And thank you again, Kira, for being here. Thank you again to our Chief Municipal Court Judge and to our Court Clerk, Victoria, for making this happen. You all have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.